God of the free, hope of the brave. For the legacy of America where diversity is celebrated and the rights of minorities are protected, we thank you. May those at this symposium grow in their understanding of that legacy. For the liberty of America, we thank you. May the symposium contribute to its defense. For the political process of America in which all of its citizens may participate, for its court system where all may seek justice, we thank you. May those here this morning always turn to it in trust. For the destiny of America, we thank you. May those here at the University of Central Florida so live that they might help to share it. May our aspirations for our country and for these young people who are our hope for the future be richly fulfilled. Amen.
Was the Constitution of the United States just violated? We are at a publicly funded university using money provided by the taxpayer, and a non-sectarian, non-denominational prayer was just heard. Moreover, you were asked to stand. Did anyone not stand? Everyone in this room stood. You didn't know what the prayer was going to be? You stood. Did anyone stand unwillingly? Not because you're tired and the day's been long and the speakers have been, we have unwilling standers. I saw your hand first in the green shirt. Sir, will you please stand up? You didn't want to stand? Are you an atheist, my friend? But you don't stand until you know where the prayer is going? Okay. Was there someone with a principled non-stance position? Sir, please stand up. And your name is? Chris? We've got a lot of principled nons. And you typically don't stand for prayers? You're not a religious person. Why did you stand? Do you think if you had remained sitting, are you here today with some friends? You're here by yourself? Does anyone else in this room know you? Do you think they might have said, "Ooh, that's the kid that didn't stand"? Yeah, you think that's likely? I think so. I think people would have said, "That's the kid over there. Oh, isn't he Chris? He's in my history class. He didn't stand. Weirdo." Do you think so? I mean, Chris, you don't look like a weirdo. You're a very nice guy, and I've now made fun of you. But that's the argument that the Supreme Court... Oh, Chris, you can sit down now. The argument that the Supreme Court used in the case Lee v. Wiseman. Can you hear me in the back? Pretty much. I'll occasionally walk away from the microphone, but if it gets bad, let me know and I'll get back here. In the case Lee v. Wiseman, the Supreme Court held that a middle school graduation, and the prayer the congressman was so good to read is exactly those words except for the part about University of Central Florida, because that wouldn't have made sense in Rhode Island. At a middle school graduation, there was a secular Jewish man there, and he had complained about an older daughter's graduation, and so the principal of the school thought he'd outfox him. He got a rabbi to write wasn't that pretty? You didn't hear Jesus Christ. You didn't hear anything that would have set off even most Reform Jews. It was not very denominational or sectarian at all. But Wiseman sued, and the Supreme Court ruled that that prayer was unconstitutional. What we're going to talk about this morning in 30 brief minutes, maybe a little bit more, is the case Lee v. Wiseman. I want to teach you a little bit about separationists versus accommodationists, which you've heard a bit about. We're also going to talk about the case Rosenberger v. UVA, and we're going to discuss some looming establishment challenges that should give you something to think about while you eat lunch. So let's begin. In Lee v. Wiseman, the majority ruled that what just happened in this room would have been unconstitutional at a middle school or high school graduation. They focused on this. The principal selected the speaker. So he's the agent of government. State-sponsored salary guy picks the speaker. Now he chose a rabbi. Rabbi in Providence is not a majority religion, but if we consider Judeo-Christian to be a broad religious grouping, then they're the majority there. And was the ceremony voluntary? For the majority, they said it's de facto voluntary. But how many of you would say, I don't care about going to my high school graduation? It's voluntary, that you still get your diploma if you don't show up, but it kind of means a lot to your grandma, and you get some gifts. So is it really voluntary, was the question. As the majority put, it's the most important ceremony in a kid's life. They didn't use the word kid because they're the Supreme Court. So it's not quite voluntary. So a student sitting there that objects to the prayer is where Chris was, not wanting to stand. But what are your choices? Your choices are stand in silence, as you all did, all of you, or sit, or vocally protest, I suppose. You could stand up and say, I object to this prayer on government property. But you really only had the choices of prayer or protest, silently or otherwise. And for the majority in this 5-4 decision, that was psychological coercion. That's what Chris said, psychological pressure. He's exactly right, according to Republican Reagan appointee Anthony Kennedy, who wrote this decision. Psychological coercion, because we are talking about young people, and they cited, and this really drove Justice Scalia up a wall, they cited psychology journals to prove that on young people the pressure is greater. And they used that to distinguish it from previous cases. You heard the Congressman Keller remark earlier that, well, gee, how can under God in the schools be unconstitutional? We start every day with a prayer in Congress. And the Supreme Court said that's okay, so it doesn't make sense. Well, for Anthony Kennedy, it does. Because an adult may have a resilience to preaching that a child does not. That children may be more susceptible to messages and to psychological coercion. I seem to remember a little bit of peer pressure in high school, but as I was the star linebacker, it was not a big deal. They also said that to say that this prayer meant nothing, that it was merely words, just, a very brief little minute. It wasn't very long. But to say that it meant nothing is an insult to the rabbi. Why was he there if it's not a big deal? And they used the arguments of those in favor of public prayer against them. In other words, because it's so important to their lives that at this most important passage point into adulthood, or into high school in the case of middle school, that God be recognized. By the same token, might it not be for a minority so important that God not be recognized? In the end, for the majority, this violated the Establishment Clause, which read, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. For the majority, in a 1992 case, this was establishment. Now the dissent, written by still the best writer on the court, however you think of Nuno Scalia, he is the best writer. He writes with a pen dipped in fire that flows acid. This is why he wouldn't make a good Chief Justice, because he said terrible things about Sandy O'Connor over the years in opinions. He doesn't build coalitions, but God, he's fun to read. And when I said, I guess I just used the Lord's name in vain, didn't I? It's a figure of speech, but if anyone was offended, I apologize. I didn't mean to. If that's the worst thing I say, we'll be out of here with good grace. Okay, so what did Scalia say? The purpose of the First Amendment was to prevent establishment, not to establish separation, utter, complete separation between church and state. Government must be neutral among religions, but need not be completely neutral between religion and irreligion. And let me read you a little bit of what Scalia had to say about the psychological argument. Quote, "We indeed live in a vulgar age, but surely our social conventions have not coarsened to the point that anyone who does not stand on his chair and shout obscenities can reasonably be deemed to have assented to everything said in his presence." In other words, has it gone so far in our respect for others that if I'm standing and not talking and you're speaking, I have to shout my disagreement or everyone assumes that I'm agreeing with what's said? He goes on, since the court does not dispute that students exposed to prayer at graduation ceremonies retain, despite subtle coercive pressures, the free will to sit, there is absolutely no basis for the court's decision. It is fanciful enough to say that a reasonable dissenter standing head erect in a class of bowed heads could believe that the group exercise signified her participation or approval of it. It is beyond the absurd to say that she could entertain such a belief while pointedly declining to rise. In other words, to those students who disagree with that inoffensive prayer, sit. Have the courage of your convictions. Moreover, for Scalia, what is so wrong with our schools teaching people to respect other religions? Right? I mean, to be silent for a little while, listen to a prayer maybe you don't agree with, isn't that something we should be inculcating in our students? Thus, Scalia. What we see in very fine form in the case Levy-Wiseman is that division between separationists and accommodationists, which is two ways of thinking about the Establishment Clause. The separationists, as you might guess, really like that metaphor, separation between church and state, a wall. It comes from, as we heard earlier from Professor Fine, a letter that Jefferson wrote to some Baptists up in Connecticut. It also, they grabbed Tom Paine, Justice Hugo Black, Justice Brennan, Justice Ginsburg, and many others belonged to this broad school. The accommodationists tried to adopt George Washington in their school, more modern. They have Rehnquist, Scalia, Thomas, and most probably future Chief Justice Roberts as of Thursday. We don't really know, but we kind of know. At least I know. I think I know. Who knows? Both sides try to grab Madison very tightly because Madison is the guy who really is the author of the First Amendment more than anyone else. Another thing that divides these two schools is not just how they think about religion, but the method they use to divine what the Constitution meant or means. Those who are separationists are often also evolutionary interpretationists who believe that we need not be chained to what the Constitution meant in 1789 or what the amendments to the Constitution meant when they were passed. Their archetypical case is Brown v. Board. In the 1950s, segregation of the races began to be more and more unacceptable to many liberal elites. And yet the Congress that passed the 14th Amendment, commanding equal protection by race, also funded segregated schools in the District of Columbia. So if you believe in original intent, you agree with the memo that Rehnquist wrote when he was clerking for the court for Justice Jackson, which said segregation is absolutely constitutional because it's in the original intent of the people. You need to have a constitutional amendment to get rid of all black and all white schools. But the evolutionary people believe differently. They believe that the Constitution announces principles, and the people who passed those constitutional amendments or passed the original Constitution may not have fully upheld the principles in practice at that time because of prejudice, which is ephemeral and shifts, but the principles endure, and we may become better at realizing those principles. This is a quote from that letter of Jefferson's. I personally get bored to tears when speakers read to me from PowerPoints because I can read faster than they can speak. So what say we just let you read this? Can you read it? No? Is it? I didn't even know Jefferson was into comedy. That's really... Anyway, that's the letter, building a wall of separation. The wall of separation comes back to us in the case of Everson in 1947. In this case, New Jersey was giving money I will separate you if I have to. In this case, New Jersey was giving money for transportation from the homes of private citizens or private students to private schools. And it was mostly Catholics. Mostly Catholic schools were getting the benefit of public transportation. And the question before the court was, is this a violation of the separation of church and state? Now, there were 9 members on the court, as there are now. 4 of them believed that it was a violation of church and state for New Jersey to fund bus fare, or to actually provide buses. 5 of them did not. Now, this case has become the separationist Bible, that they refer to it, but the irony is that the majority decision upheld the use of public funds to assist religious schools at the same time that it resurrected this wall of separation in modern form. But the point is that Hugo Black was saying, this far and absolutely no further. That it's a generally available public welfare to provide transportation to kids regardless of whether they go to public, private, or private religious schools. So it's available to everyone. The government isn't funding religion. It's funding education, indirectly funding religion. Today, this case is used in cases like Wiseman to highlight how strong separation should be. Even the strictest separationists, important to have those words separated, make exceptions for ceremonial religion. What they call the opening prayers at Congress is a ceremonial religion. Certain traditions, as well as public spaces where they'll have, a baby Jesus, as long as it's open for the menorah, and as long as the witches can have their Wiccan symbol there too. So there's certain exceptions where government is allowed to foster religion, even for separationists. Another case which separationists point to is the Lemon Test, which we've heard about, and it's also described in your little book. The irony of Lemon is that it was written by Warren Burger. And Burger was put on the court to rein in some of these liberal cases, like the separation of church and state cases. And what he did on this case was establish a 3-pronged test for all future cases to try and provide some regularity and predictability. Laws must have a secular purpose, or they fail the first prong. They must neither advance nor suppress religion as a primary effect of the legislation, or they fail the second prong. And does not overly entangle government with religion or religious institutions. That's the rather novel third prong of Lemon. What he meant there, this was a case where, for example, in Rhode Island, they were giving textbooks that were non-religious to religious schools. So the point was, we're helping education, but there's no way God could be in this textbook because it's an approved textbook. And then one of the other linked cases was, we're sending public school teachers into private schools that are religious, but only for non-religious topics. But Burger's point was this, that you would have to police the schools. You'd have to monitor the behavior of these public employees and these publicly provided textbooks to make sure that they weren't doing that. In other words, we would be entangled with religion. We'd be trying to determine, and I don't know about you, but I learned geometry from a public school teacher who was very religious. He used to keep a Bible on his desk, and he went to Liberty. No, he followed Falwell. He didn't graduate from Liberty, but he would say things like, "Now, a postulate is something you accept without proof, like I accept the Bible right there." And that was his example, and none of us knew to call the Supreme Court and say that the Constitution was being violated. But that's an example of what Burger was afraid of, that you can take a textbook that doesn't have God in it, and a teacher can use that textbook to inculcate religious values unless the state is there watching to make sure it doesn't happen. So today, many separationists use the Lemon Test even today, although some of them still think it's unworkable. It failed actually in practice to be used in most establishment cases because it didn't have the kind of consistency in application that Burger thought it did. What about the accommodationists? Well, they look to Madison and to Washington, and it's a little tricky to do that because like many of the founders, Ben Franklin, Jefferson, a number of others, it's probable that they were deists. Now, deism is a vanished philosophical religion, if you will, that believed that God existed, but he set the world going and let it run by the rules of reason and rationality, by the laws of science. So it's best captured by the quote from Voltaire, the existence of a watch presupposes the existence of a watchmaker. But the watchmaker isn't there every moment saying, okay, now tick, right? The watchmaker's off in Switzerland. So they see a distant God and not an active God. And in fact, Jefferson, who was much the most radical deist, went ahead and wrote a Bible that took all the miracles out of the Bible. He wrote a Bible that had no miracles in it, and he said this is what really happened with Jesus, and he wasn't resurrected, according to Jefferson. So when accommodationists look to things like deism or deist figures, one thing they should be cautious of is that religion didn't mean for them necessarily what it means to us today. Moreover, original intent is their chosen method of constitutional interpretation. But what did the founders believe should be done about prayer in the public schools? Anyone? What did the founders believe about prayer in the public schools? Somebody know? Any of them? Jefferson, Madison? Yeah.
Well, the Congress is that a lot of them funded, Bibles in schools. And they gave money to buy Bibles to have in schools. And they also believe that there should be separate kind of contradiction.
Actually, there were no public schools. It was a trick question. It's a nice try, though. First I make fun of Chris. Now I'm mean to you. I'm never going to be asked back. I really do apologize. The truth is, the founders believed nothing about public schools because there weren't any. All schools were religious. Even the Baptists got their own college, which they had opposed because, higher education wasn't deemed all that necessary. But Brown University, my alma mater, which is so far left the Baptist church behind that it's not scary. But they were originally the Baptist answer to Harvard and Yale and all those wealthier denominations. But so a lot of the things that we apply establishment cases to would be very nonsensical to the founders. But the accommodationists do make some very strong historical claims. For example, when they were debating that little First Amendment thing, nobody mentioned this wall of separation. The idea of a wall of separation was not present in any of those debates. That this Congress had paid chaplains. It opened with prayers. And all the presidents except Jefferson issued strongly religious proclamations about days of prayer and the recognition of God's role. They prayed on Bibles. So the accommodationists point to the vibrant role that religion played at our founding as proof that the founders would approve their side. Here's another quote that, would you like me to read this? Okay. Oh, I guess it is a little small. Okay. I didn't mean to give you an eye test this morning. That no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. Now, what accommodationists do with this famous quote from Madison is say, look what's not there. What's not there is actions, one, but more importantly, limitations on what government can do other than fund religion. Madison's point was, you can't tax me to make me fund beliefs I don't agree, nor can you punish me for professing a belief that I don't share, or that you don't share, the government doesn't share. But there's nothing in there about the government must be neutral between religions or between religion and non-religion. They also point to the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance was passed by the last Articles of Confederacy Congress and then reapproved by the first Congress in which Jimmy Madison was sitting. And that was the Congress that approved the First Amendment, and the very next day approved this: religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. If you go to the University of Michigan, that quote is on one of their main campus buildings because they were covered under the Northwest Ordinance. So the idea was that government would encourage religion. How much clearer does it have to be? Although in context, please be aware that all schools were religious at this time. So it's not clear how far we can take that. The core of accommodationism in the modern era is this: silence on religion is not always neutral for government, as it tends to favor secularism or atheism over religion. The First Amendment forbids funding religion or favoring a particular religion over other religions, but it does not stop you from favoring religion over irreligion or taking cognizance, recognizing the powerful role religion plays in the lives of citizens, or in the President's words, its wonder-working power, so long as certain lines are not crossed. Okay, I was told that I would be able to find a volunteer who was an evangelical Christian UCF student. Do I have one of... I won't make fun of you. I'm not going to ask you tough questions. Sir, you are a brave man after what's happened to the two previous people. Stand up. What is your name? Dan. All right, Dan, I now need an atheist UCF student. This was going to be a harder thing. Oh, sir, right away. And your name is? Jeff? Okay. Jeff, I'm afraid that by standing you volunteered to pay the new lecture tax here. No, it's really light. I'll reimburse you afterwards, don't worry. How much do you have, what's the smallest bill you got in your wallet? $1? You sure? I was hoping for a 5, but okay, we'll take $1. Can you take out your $1, please? All right. Now, I'm the Student Activities Fund here at UCF, and I've decided that Dan's idea, you know about this idea, right, Dan? You're going to start this Christian magazine here? Yeah, because you take seriously what it says in the Acts of the Apostles, that you must proclaim to the world the truth that Jesus Christ is the risen Savior, and that there is no way to the Father but through Him. You believe those things, and I'm not mocking them in any way. I'm just asking. Okay. Now, Jeff, I'm the Student Activities Fund. Dan has told me about this magazine he wants to found here, and I've decided that your Student Activities Fund $1 should go to him. Please deliver that $1 to him as a condition of being a student here. No. Jeff, do you want to get thrown out of school? I'm the Student Activities Fund. We've assessed this fee. Why aren't you doing that, Jeff? Do you think it violates the Constitution to make you do that? So it's okay to do that as long as there's some atheist magazine that balances it? Okay. So you would be willing to pay as long as it was a free speech zone, but not if it was the only student magazine. Okay. How many people think even if there were a lot of magazines out there, there was like a student Democrat magazine or Republican magazine, but that whatever else is funded, we shouldn't be funding this evangelical magazine? Anybody believe that? Isn't that what Madison warned us about? Direct funding of religious evangelicalism. Direct funding of speech that you disagree with by a governmental body. Okay, gentlemen, sit down, please. We're going to call this magazine of Dan's UCF Wide Awake. We're going to have as our mission statement on page 2, to challenge Christians to live in word and deed according to the faith they proclaim, and to encourage students to consider what a personal relationship with Jesus Christ means. On the masthead of our UCF Wide Awake, it's going to say, "The hour has come for you to awake from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed." And I'm blanking on which book of the Bible that is in. It's in one of Paul's epistles. Anyway, how many people object to this, that your student funding money is going to go to this here at UCF? Anyone? I'd say about, shall we say 10% would consider the high school students non-voting? All right. I mean, not that you don't matter, it's just not your university yet. This was the facts presented to the Supreme Court in Rosenberger versus UVA. And the majority held that it was constitutional for a student activities fund to pay for a magazine called the UVA Wide Awake. That it was allowed to tax, which is what a student activities fee is, by a government, which is what a university, public university, is, an agent of government, because it would be viewpoint discrimination not to, that the school had set up what's a free speech zone, and they fund philosophical journals, they fund political journals. How can they not fund religion journals? And the university isn't using its own speech. It would be wrong for the university to say, hey, we're the University of Virginia, here's our masthead, Jesus Christ is the only way to get to heaven. That would be wrong, but it is students doing it. And the benefit to religion is incidental. Now, the dissent, written by Justice Souter, said this: "That whirring sound, that's Madison turning in his grave at warp speed." This is exactly what he said we could not do. The university is compelling students to pay for religious speech they disagree with. That's different than, I'm a Republican and my student fee went to fund those America-hating liberal bastards. That's constitutional. But not about religion. Why did I focus this morning, and now we're in the afternoon, on Rosenberger and Wiseman? Wiseman is as far as the court has gone, I believe, in enforcing protection of minority views against establishment, that even that little bit of psychological coercion that a 14-year-old might feel is too much. And later, in a descendant case, they said the same rule applied to student-led prayers at football games if they used the public address system, that the public address system becomes the state. Rosenberger, in my opinion, is as far as the court has gone towards direct funding of religion. They illustrate the crucial role of the swing voters on the modern Supreme Court. Because you know who was in the majority on both those cases? You win! So the next nominee, Roberts is a done deal, but the next nominee to this Supreme Court is going to be a very important person on establishment cases. Now, you may not be able to read that one. Can you read it? Damn it. Graphics. I'm going to fire my graphics guy. I'll read it. The 5-4 vote in Lee was Kennedy, O'Connor, Souter, Stevens, and Blackmun. Blackmun is now replaced by Breyer, who votes pretty much like Blackmun did, only a little more conservative. And Rehnquist, who is now Roberts, Thomas, and White, who is now Justice Ginsburg, and Scalia. So there is a shift there. Ginsburg would vote differently from White on this case, but it's a very narrow ruling. And then on Rosenberger, it was a 5-4 vote, was Kennedy, Rehnquist, Scalia, and Thomas versus Ginsburg, Breyer, Stevens, and Souter, with Sandra Day concurring with the conservatives, but in a way that she so often does, she trimmed it. She had a concurrence published separately that said, well, these are a very special case, it's not going to extend, don't be afraid, next time it comes up, I might change my mind. O'Connor and Kennedy have been so vital on establishment because they aren't predictable. They seem to change their minds on you would think that someone who voted one way on Wiseman would vote the same liberal view on Rosenberger or vice versa. Not so with these two. On a number of the cases, they are the swing in this area. And who has George Bush said he will appoint to replace O'Connor? What model of judge? Thomas and Scalia. So if he holds true to his promise to his conservative base, then this sort of swing issue is over. Now, I said I'd conclude by talking about some looming conflicts in establishment. By the way, this morning, a district court in Pennsylvania opened a debate about could Dover, Pennsylvania be the first school district in America to teach intelligent design alongside creationism this very morning that we're having this symposium. So question, does a school discriminate against religion by only teaching evolution? No, we have a debate. Does a school establish religion by teaching intelligent design alongside evolution? In the case Epperson v. Arkansas in 1968, the Supreme Court ruled that a school or that Arkansas may not forbid the teaching of evolution. So that's clearly unconstitutional. That was a 9-zip ruling. So you can't ban evolution. But then, as described in your little booklet, Edwards v. Aguilar, 1987, held that Arkansas could not mandate the teaching of creationism. That is the current precedent in this. There were 2 dissenters in Edwards, Scalia and Rehnquist. Thomas wasn't yet on the court, but he would probably agree with that. I don't know where Roberts would come down on that one because there's a procedural issue on it. But I don't think it's predictable that this court would strike down a creationism, intelligent design. I think it probably would, but I'm not certain that it would. But this conflict is growing, not shrinking. And it's growing because we've changed our minds in America. 45% of Americans believe in young earth creationism. And young earth creationism is the belief that the earth was created between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, and that dinosaurs and humans coexisted. 45% of us believe that. A minority of us believe in evolution, and the rest are intelligent design of what's called long earth creationism, which was probably a majority view at the time of the Scopes trial in 1925-27. So you have a change in the public that they've adopted this view, which H.L. Mencken and a number of people were embarrassed of in 1925. So we have this new force in our public which is bringing this issue back to the front. A couple of key other issues, and then I want to stop for your questions. We're okay on time?
We've got 10 more minutes.
But 10 more minutes, including...
We'll for 3 minutes, and we'll do 5 minutes of questions.
Okay. Let's rock through these. Religious tuition, there's one case in the Supreme Court where they hold to that it's constitutional. A lot of states and localities are looking at this. And then, here's a big one. Can a recipient of government funds discriminate and say, sorry, we don't hire Jews, we don't hire Catholics, we don't hire gays. The president is committed to expanding social services provided by religious organizations, but if Pat Robertson is hired to provide drug counseling and a gay man says, gee, I want to work with you. Now, why he would do that, I have no clue. But if he applied for the job, is it legal for Robertson to say, sorry, your lifestyle disagrees with what we teach, you can't work here? It is legal for churches to do that. It is legal for religious universities. When I was desperate on the job market, I was applying to all these schools and having to write statements of faith about how my relationship with Jesus Christ would affect my teaching. That doesn't happen in any other job in America unless you're applying to be a seminarian. But at universities and religious institutions, it's okay. Concluding thoughts. Even the most radical deist of the major founders, and we're leaving Thomas Paine out of here, acknowledged the importance of religion at the core of our founding beliefs. He is, after all, the author of the Declaration of Independence, which, unlike the Constitution, recognizes the Creator. The Constitution is devoid of religion, even though it was written by a more conservative economic group. But it was, Jefferson said, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Yet the protection of religious minorities and dissenters has been one of our founding ideals as well, and it must never be forgotten. If you compare us to most other Judeo-Christian nations, we have a much better record on the Judeo portion of not persecuting Jews. Not to say that anti-Semitism hasn't been a problem in this country, but compared to the European countries, we have a very good record on this issue. We may be uniquely religious. We're more religious than most Western democracies, and it may be because we haven't hurt our churches by bringing state into them. I was mountain biking in Iceland a few years ago, and we kept passing these churches, and my guide kept saying, yeah, there's no one in there. The government pays for it, but there's no one in there. So maybe having government-funded churches hurts religion, and if the separation of church and state has led to the vitality of our religious institutions. And I think these issues are going to burn ever hotter over the next 2 decades because we are becoming more diverse. A lot of things would have never come up when we just had this assumed Christianity, or at best Judeo-Christianity. But now, as more and more Muslims move to America, as more and more Hindus, and as more people become atheist or agnostic, these issues will become harder and harder to deal with.
My question is, in your opinion, do you believe schools should be able to refer to the Bible for educational purposes as a textbook?
Not as a textbook. I don't think that would be held constitutional, but it has always been constitutional to teach religious history, or to teach the religious role in history. But the Bible as a textbook would not survive constitutional scrutiny.
Do you believe that having associations such as Fellowship of Christian Athletes, FCA, in high schools should be allowed, considering that, say, a group of Jewish kids would prefer to have Fellowship of Jewish Athletes, probably would not be allowed? Do you think that's advocating assumed Christianity complex?
If it were not allowed, if you could show that the school said the Christian athletes were supported, allowed to exist, and the Jewish athletes were not, suppose you had like a star Jewish linebacker, and he wasn't allowed to have a, group of his own, that would never survive constitutional scrutiny. The question, though, is the Rosenberger question that you're really asking, which is, can the school allow us a student group that is explicitly religious, because it will create psychological coercive pressures to join it? And I think that those who ruled on Rosenberger in the dissent, some of them might have problems with that.
Earlier you spoke about kids being more impressionable than adults. Where do you draw that line of children being impressionable, of saying the pledge, or just in general with school and stuff?
There is no firm rule. I mean, we are really screwed about age in this country, aren't we? I mean, at 18, you can get drafted or volunteer for the military. You can start your own business. You can get married young you can get married young. You can be an adult entertainer at 18, but you can't have a beer. So we have this really weird attitude towards age, and there isn't a clear constitutional standard about the age of majority, right? I mean, you can be executed at 17 for crimes you committed at 16 in this country. So there isn't a clear constitutional standard. Where would I draw it? I kind of respect 17 and 18-year-olds. I think if you don't have the courage to sit down for a prayer you don't agree with, then I don't have a problem with it, but then I'm not on the Supreme Court and haven't been thinking deeply about it.
Thank you.
I was noticed during all your speech, when you're talking about the dichotomy between religion and anti-religion, you always mention atheists, and that's the argument in mainstream media is atheist and religious. You failed to ask me if I was agnostic when I stood up. Mm-hmm. I want to say, is there some significance for the reason why you chose it, to recognize atheists over agnostics?
The distinction is just much clearer. I mean, there are a lot of agnostics in this country, and I didn't mean to exclude or leave them out. It's just a clearer break. And you're right, the media does make that, but there's a lot of scientists who are agnostics. They say, I'm not an atheist because I haven't seen proof that God doesn't exist. I'm an agnostic because if God came down and shook my hand, I'd be very willing to believe. Right?
Thank you.
Can I tell a joke about agnostics? An agnostic is someone who used to be indecisive, but now he's not sure.
What do you find on an atheist's tombstone?
I don't know.
All dressed up with nowhere to go.
That's good. He'll be here all week, try the veal.
I was wondering how the Christian community would feel if in an urban city environment with a large Islamic population, how would Christian students feel if they were the minority and they had to stop to pray 5 times a day to Allah?
Yeah, I can't speak for how Christians would feel about that, but this is a debate that comes up more and more as Muslims become an important part of the American social system. One of the things Muslims do is they have a 5-time-a-day call to prayer, and often it is quite loud, and so there have been local governments that have tried to shut it down. But we didn't do free exercise today because I barely had enough time for accommodationism, or establishment. But on these cases, what happens is when the local Christians say, we can't have that. Why did I adopt a southern accent there? Sorry. We cannot have that loud Muslim on the prayer thing 5, I can't sleep. And what happens, though, is that you have to have a generally applicable law, and when they investigate it, guess what? Christian churches are ringing bells, and no one's complaining. So you have to have a decibel standard that applies to everyone fairly. It applies to the Muslim call to prayer, as well as the Catholic Church tolling at 9 a.m. and waking up all the professors. Yes?
Just a real quick question on intelligent design. I've not been exposed to all the intricacies of it. But do you see that there might be a problem if we were to open up to something, to me that's just ridiculous. How many other creation myths are we going to be asked to teach?
I don't know if you watched The Daily Show, but they subtly referred to that the other day. They had a scientist defending evolution, an intelligent design spokesperson with a doctorate, and a New Age freak who was advocating the teaching of her belief that the world was created by forces gelling. And I think you have a point. I think it will be, if intelligent design is held to be that a creator invented the world, then what about all the people who think it was the flying spaghetti monster? What about all these people? That's actually a website, by the way, quite amusing. They've written letters to the Kansas School Board and said, we believe in the flying spaghetti monster, please teach it. And that is, but it's beyond the humor, there is a real point. How do you determine what a religion is? And how many creation myths do you teach in the public schools? It is a problem.
My question is, what do you believe is the difference between a classroom where evolution is being taught with students who do not believe in it, who are religious, and a classroom where religious teachings are being taught with students who do not believe in that?
This is an excellent question. I think it's the best one, which means that I have a tough time answering it. I think that people are taught all the time in the public schools things that they don't agree with. For example, if a resident of, say, Virginia in 1920 were to move north in the middle of his high school, he would have learned a very different lesson about the Civil War. That we don't have the right to say, I disagree. We have boards of curriculum that approve these things. In a science class, if you ask me, science is what should be taught. Things that are not scientific, whether they offend you or anyone else, don't belong there. Things that are scientific, if they offend you, I'm sorry. But if the general consensus of the scientific community says that we evolved from simpler life forms over 3.5 billion years, I think if that's a general consensus, which it is, then it should be taught in science courses. That's my opinion, which is what you asked. I understand, though, the deeply held pain. I mean, I live in a very liberal part of our country, the People's Republic of Arlington, Virginia, and there's an even more liberal community over in Montgomery. We're the liberal Beltway bandits, and they tried to put this sex education curriculum into effect, which was a bunch of liberal crap. I mean, they had this thing like 10% of the population is gay. That is such a lie. That is one of the most abused social science statistics, and that's why it shouldn't have been taught. Not because it offended people or made people unhappy, but because it's not true. So in a science course, teach science. In a sex education course, teach sex education. And if you want to learn about creationism, go to church. That's my opinion.